It's called To the Ancestor.
We got rid of the traffic and brought you all into the room.
Have you got you calmed down so I can introduce the speaker? So, welcome to the Friday night lecture series sponsored by the Scandinavian Foundation and the Department of World Languages. Just 2 months ago, they changed the title from foreign language to world language because they are teaching such an abundance of language from all over the world. So now it's world languages they're teaching, instead, not foreign languages only. And I just thought you should know this. Tonight's lecture is the first in a series starting from October. And our first speaker tonight is Dr. Susan, speaker in the lecture series is Dr. Susan Carter. And Susan was born in Salem, Oregon, and has lived most of her adult life in Portland, Oregon, and San Francisco. Her ancestral heritage is Swedish, Norwegian, Lewis and Clark College as an undergraduate student and earned her master's and Ph.D. in humanities with a concentration on philosophy and religion at the California Institute of Intergral Studies in San Francisco. Having worked in the corporate world in a number of years, Susan is now in her second adult life. Second adult life as an associate professor teaching in the interdisciplinary graduate program at Marylhurst University and the California Institute of Integral Studies. It's very difficult with all these words. Susan's academic and personal interests come together with the study of prehistoric symbolism and art as an expression of an ancient spiritual tradition. This is one of the reasons he's drawn to rock art, not only in Sweden, but around the world. Susan has participated in volunteer work on rock art documentation with the Scandinavian Sweden, with efforts of almost volunteer group. All information documented is being added to a growing electronic database with the Tanumshede Museum.
Rock Carving Museum.
Yeah, it was during the work that most of the images you see this evening are photographed. Not only is Susan of Norwegian and Swedish heritage, she's also a member of the Scandinavian Heritage Foundation. And we have a lot of talents in the Scandinavian Heritage Foundation and in the Scandinavian community, and we like to utilize all those talents. And it's nice to have somebody from the Heritage Foundation to speak tonight. And Susan's presentation is called Written in Stone. You already have it up there. Ancient Rock Carvings of Scandinavia. So let us welcome Susan.
Carl, what are we going to do about the lights?
Turn them off.
Do we want to turn them all off? We're experimenting. I thought there might be a light up here, so bear with me for just a moment. That's really dark. Is that okay for people?
Yeah.
Okay, we'll see if it's
We may
okay
want
for
to
me.
leave the door.
Thank you for your flashlight.
You're welcome.
Well-prepared woman.
We may want to leave the door open in case
Actually,
someone
this is-
does come
yeah,
later
let's
and
leave it
won't trip.
So I just leave it, put the garbage can in here, okay?
Excellent. And that gives me more light. Excellent. I will
We
probably
have an
to
open
repeat it.
door policy here, you see?
Well, I am so pleased to be here tonight, and I want to thank you all for turning out on a Friday night. It's wonderful to have a full room. I actually have friends and students in the room as well, and it's always fun to see them in a different situation when I'm not teaching a class. So thank you for coming, all of you. I am very passionate about rock art. And my friends Joe spent thousands of dollars to see thousands of rocks. And that's pretty much true. I'm not quite sure why I'm so drawn. I'm very connected to ancient cultures when I'm crawling around on rocks. And so when I had the opportunity to join this volunteer documentation project in Tanumshede, I jumped at the opportunity, and I really would like to get back. I often teach in the summer, so it's difficult to get back there. So, for thousands of years, ancient peoples who have lived and traveled in what is present-day Scandinavia have left a wide variety of carvings in rocks. The most numerous rock carvings in this part of the world are actually in Eastern Norway and Western Sweden. And the rock carvings that I will be speaking about tonight are mostly in the Tanumshede area where I did the work. And most of what you will be seeing, the images are also from that area, although there will be a few exceptions. So to give you an overview of the area we're talking about here, and probably everybody here knows this already. Sweden, present-day Sweden, is about 1,000 miles north and south, about 250 miles in places east and west. And the area that we are speaking about mainly tonight is this area. You can see a lot of coastline, much more coastline than it looks from just looking north and south because of all these little squiggles here. So water was very important, and water transportation was very important. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yeah, we can't see.
Oh, uh-oh. Let's see if I can do, does that work? Okay, thank you for speaking up. Okay. Now I can reach my computer. Hang on. So, just about the same size as the state of California. So when we talk about how much rock art is there, compare it to if we had found this many sites in California, how significant that might really be. So we have the north part of Sweden, it's basically in two parts, southern. The north is much colder and very different geologically than the south. The south is much milder with more arable farmland and more densely populated. This is the land traditionally lived in by the Sami, the indigenous people of the Nordic countries. And this is the present-day Scandinavian folks, which were Germanic peoples that came up and mixing with people that were already here. Southern Sweden is relatively flat and arable country with geologic, and to the north are geologically newer surfaces culminating in the northwestern mountains. And we can pretty much divide the rock art the same way, northern rock carvings and the southern rock carvings. And here in this chart, hopefully you can all see it. What I will mainly be talking about this evening are these two areas that are highlighted, Bronze Age as well in southern Sweden. The north, mostly hunting, fishing, gathering. These are the oldest rock carvings. And then to the south with the early agricultural development with animal husbandry, livestock of the southern part. So this actually, just this year, this date has gone back to 9,000 BCE. So all of these dates are quite fluid. Some of the rock art's going to be older, some of it's going to be newer. But the more it's studied, the older we're finding some of the rock art that's been hidden to date. Also note that the introduction of writing is not until very, very late. And runes, which could be considered a form of writing, are much later than the rock art I'm going to be talking about tonight. Rock art really varies. So we have little tiny dots like this called cup marks that might be only an inch or two in diameter, and very, very simple. Then they're also very, very large. This is a reproduction I'm showing you so you can see it in situ in the next frame. This elk is 8 feet tall, and this is a northern piece. Here it is in situ. There's his beard, ears, in a large rock island in a big river. Still very simple, but very big. Then there are large compositional groups that seem to be in panels. Boats, animals, and we'll see a lot more of this as we proceed. Often the rock art is found at the edge of a forested area, edges of the fields where there's a transition to the forest. And this is pretty much how we see it when we're working on the rock art. What you might not be aware of is there's rock art right here. And this is actually a panel that we worked on the summer I was there. We also see rock art in farmers' fields. So we have permission to walk onto other people's properties, and we had a team in this pasture for about a week. A lot of the rock art is along the water. As I mentioned, water, of course, would be very important. Not only was it a place where one would get water for survival, but also where migration routes of elk and deer would be traveling. And then along the coastline, it would have been considered a part of the main highway. Are there any seats left?
Yeah.
There's one here way down in front, if you don't mind splitting out.
Dan,
Well, there's two right there.
Okay, here.
Dan, mom stayed with you. Okay.
Sorry to disturb.
No problem. Glad you could make it. So a lot of rock art along water, creeks, streams, bays, lakes. And the carved rocks are frequently oriented in relation to the movement of the sun. The best time to view them, when they're not painted, is when the sun is rising as the light comes across the rock, and when the sun is setting, again, as it's coming across the rock. When the sun is at high noon, it can be very difficult to see the rock art that's not painted. And often, a lot of rock art has running water over it. Now, of course, times have changed. These are thousands of years old. Perhaps the land was not exactly this way at the time that these were carved. However, there's enough of them that are situated on slopes so that drainage in this very rainy land, green land, would be running across the slopes. And so they think it was actually intentional, and often there's ships with the water running over them. When these rocks were originally carved, they would have been, the water, the ocean would have been anywhere from 50 to 100 feet higher above its current level. So most of these were probably much nearer to bodies of water than they are today. Sweden was actually pushed down by the last ice age, and it's been ever so slowly rising since the last melt over 9,000 years ago. So all of these are about 100 feet away from water. The ancients knew which rocks to carve. They chose them carefully. There's a lot of granite in Sweden. They chose smooth surfaces, often sloping in relation to the sun. Often they're facing south. They would have chosen either granite and by the coasts, and this is in the Tanumshede area, and this is granite. And there's also a rock called gneiss, which is metamorphically formed with pressure that's further inland that they also used. Here's granite, and again, very hard to see, but there's a ship here. This is one of the few female forms. Probably these were pecked using a loose rock or something very hard like obsidian, and then they may very well have been smoothed out. Many of them you can actually see the peck marks, and many of them have been smoothed out this way. We don't know if they were smoothed at the time or if it's been the age and the elements that have smoothed them further. You can see here, one of the reasons it's so important to document the rock art is because of the degradation that's going on. Acid rain is hard on them. They're in farmers' fields, so cattle are walking on them, breaks my heart. We've got lichen, moss, and then just the freezing and thawing that happens in Sweden with the seasons. So a lot of it's flaking, cracking, and falling off. So this is how we register the rock art. These are just little pieces of boats and some cut marks, and this is how the panels will be put into the database. At the end of this big week, Gerhard Milster, who's the director of this, he comes with a crew of 3 or 4 men, and they have these huge ladders, and he climbs to the top of these ladders and takes digital photographs. So this is in preparation. I'm going to be showing you 3 different kinds of rock art. In that I mean painted, non-painted, and chopped. So the painted rock arts, for the most part, are in tourist panels. And you can see here that a boardwalk has been constructed. I don't know if you can see these. There's little plaques that tell you what you're looking at. And then the rock art itself has been painted red, and this is to discourage people from clambering on the rocks. And you do have a very good view. You can take good photographs, and a lot of this art is right off the highway. So, you know, this could be, I can't remember the specific one, but I don't think it's more than 50 feet off the main road. So these are very easy, many of them are very, very easy to get to, and so they've decided to take care of it in this way, and for the most part they've been fairly successful. There's been more vandalism lately, but not too much. I do want to say that there have been some carvings that have been painted red. They think it's red ochre. We don't know if all of them were painted at one time or not. If it was red ochre, that is a mineral that's found in Sweden, and it would have been burnt and then mixed with either egg or fat to have it adhere to the rocks. And around the world, ochre is often used in a ritual context. So that's, I think, one reason why they've chosen to paint them in red. Plus, it's a great color, you can really see. So, back to the north. The north carvings are quite simple, often deer or elk. There are some compositions, but there's not a lot of variety. There's a few birds, a few humans, elk, and deer. And then in contrast, we have the farmers' panels, which are quite diverse. You can see here a lot of cut marks, a lot of ships, animals, perhaps dancers, or some sort of ritual going on here, reindeer, people with weapons, probably ceremonial, and we will revisit that a little bit later. Perhaps hunting, suns, all sorts of things are going on in this panel. The other thing that's interesting is often the art seems to follow the lines in the rock. We don't know if these lines were there. Do they cross the lines? Often they are within the lines. So we don't know if these were intentional stories, if they were meant to be followed in sequence. We don't know if the ancient people would just find their favorite image and concentrate on that, or if this actually tells a story or a myth. We don't think it's graffiti. I can say that with some certainty. So in the north, the Proto-Sami and early Sami led an organized nomadic lifestyle. They followed the reindeer. They lived with the reindeer. So they really knew their behavior. It was very important to them. This was their food, clothing, and shelter. So we often see places where the reindeer probably crossed in migration along many of the rivers. And I'm going to just show you a little, I'm working on a documentary, so I'm going to stick a few little clips in here and there so you can hear the sound and get the ambiance. Can you hear that? It's pretty loud. So we think often that the rock art actually was utilitarian and was also a teaching tool. Here again, we'll show the elk. This is the perfect place to cross this river. And again, it's thought that the elk was probably here to show a migration route. Back to the farmers' panels. So these again are in the more southern areas where people were combining hunting and gathering with developing agriculture. So we have not only game animals, but other activities that are going on, which are not showing up here, perhaps here. Another piece. This looks like a hunter. This looks like some sort of snare. Again, snares. Animals. And, excuse me, and let me also point out, which I'll show you a little bit later too, perhaps ritualized activities. So these axes aren't actually weapons, they're ceremonial objects. And then up here we see the men perhaps dancing with some sort of spear, club, maybe even an instrument to beat on the rocks as a form of music. What we do see is that all of the carvings seem to have something to do with survival. And for me, spirituality is not religion. Spirituality is finding meaning in one's life. So the meaning making, a lot of that was about survival and what needed to happen in regards to survival and an honoring of nature and all of those things that go into maintaining human life. So of course, nothing can happen without the sun, and we often see sun symbols here with women holding the sun. We see a human figure milking some sort of very strange animal that also looks pregnant. A reindeer down here, and the ubiquitous cup marks. Women are still associated with the sun, and the sun is still female in Scandinavian countries. We also see the sun as bodies with what are called cross marks. And here are two men. This is probably part of a ritual. This man is phallic and has this axe. We don't know what the sex of this one is. We also see the sun in boats, and this is an example of one of the paintings that would have been documented. As a matter of fact, this is one of my panels. So many cultures around the world thought that the sun traveled in a boat through the sky, went away, went to the underworld, and then came back up the next day. So this may very well be what was happening here. So a lot of sun imagery. And then as agriculture developed, so did animal husbandry. This was a very important economic activity in the Bronze Age. So here we have some humans doing something with animals, and who knows what kind they are. It's interesting, many of them look pregnant. Again, knowing how to care for animals, understanding the distinct seasons, all of these things would have been very important for survival. Here is an auroch, which is an ancient ox with a sun or a cup mark between its horns. Both male and female had horns. So we don't know what the sex of this is, but we see a number of these, and we'll see them later in conjunction with drawing wagons. This is one of my favorite pieces, which I took in the rain getting bit by lots of mosquitoes. We also see humans in celebration, maybe dancing here. And then note this ard, which is a predecessor of the plow. We'll return to this off to the side. But we see humans in celebration, dancing, perhaps a ritual scene. There's another line of dancers. Again, some phallic figures with the cup marks, perhaps a pregnant animal, animals and boats. So these could very well be symbols of celebration, of fertility, and fertility and creativity in the broadest sense, not just procreation, but creativity and fertility of all things. There's also acrobats, often in relation to these boats, which appear to be ritual as well. There's cup marks. We have a shaman here. I'm not sure what this is. And this is being compared here in the museum at Tanumshede to ancient Egyptian and Cretan bull leapers and Egyptian acrobats also. It's not the only place in the world we see them. There's also what's called an adorante posture, an adoring, invoking, or worshiping posture with the human, hands upraised, usually with only 3 or 4 fingers, never 5. We don't know if this means that there are deities present, that there actually is a worshiping going on, or are these people telling stories? Does this mean this is the story of, or once upon a time? We're not certain, but they are supposedly important figures and associated with something that is not mundane. There's also plowmen, often phallic, usually phallic. Phallic oxen with cup marks. One of my Marylhurst colleagues said, "That's manure." I'm not sure that's true, but it did make everybody laugh. There were rituals up until the late 1800s of a plowman holding a branch in the springtime, going 3 times around the field in the direction of the sun to ensure fertility. And this lasted up until the 1800s. So who knows? Maybe they were doing it at this early date as well. But obviously a sign of fertility. And now you get to laugh again. I'm kind of having fun bringing these to life. so I can drink some water.
Oh.
This is where my mind goes when I see the art. It's alive to me. And then as I mentioned before, sometimes we just see the art by itself. Might be off to the side of a panel. We saw one above the dancers. So, are they dancing to ask for good crops? Are they dancing because they got great crops? We don't know. But I do think that even this early on, there were abstract symbols that meant something. So when someone saw this art, they knew what it meant. We don't, but they did. We've got the cut marks, we've got the art, there's the ships, there's a lot of things that were abstract symbols. There are also shaman, ceremonial acts, horns, a bird or a beak type of mask. They think they wore masks. There's a rubbing of it so you can see it a little bit clearer. There's also rock art that has now been validated by actual archaeological artifacts. And the lure is one of them. So here we have a shaman watch, which we've been seeing. Here's the horns. The Vikings didn't really wear horns, you know that, right? This is what would have been worn. They're not really horns at all, but we call them that. They found these helmets and lures, which are very large wind instruments. They were made out of wood and then later bronze, and they found over 60 of them now in Scandinavia, intact, and some of them you can still play, which is quite amazing, from the Bronze Age. Here's a rubbing of 3, perhaps shaman, playing lures. There's a 4th one down here. And this is also a good example of the degradation that's going on with the rock art. This is just simply chipped off, so the shaman's losing his lure here. This is what the rock art looks like at midnight with a big torch over it. They're very interesting. They almost look the opposite of carved in some of the images. And you can actually hear these if you Google lure online. You can pick up these sounds. We've also found archaeological artifacts of weapons. This was probably a real weapon, the dagger. This probably a ceremonial weapon. Many of these have a very thin coating of metal over clay, so they wouldn't really have been used for cutting. Doesn't mean you couldn't have bonked somebody over the head. But because of the way they're depicted, we think that many of them were ceremonial. Next to the cup mark, boats are one of the most numerous of the carvings. And we see them in many shapes and sizes with a lot of different activities going on with them. Here you can actually see they may be fishing. And as I pointed out, there's really long coastlines, so boats would have been really important in a major form of transportation in ancient times as well. Again, the sun boat. It's also believed that boats were to signify not only physical travel, but also spiritual travel, and perhaps to the afterlife or the underworld. Have these very interesting figures with birds. Shaman. Some scholars think that these crewmen are actually spirits that are traveling to the next life. Again, associated with all sorts of activities. Often associated with cut marks and other strange, who knows what, in this rather fantastical setting with animal-looking carvings, often associated with what we think are celebrations or rituals. Here is a good example of how easy it is to see this. Here's a sun circle, and here's another figure over here. This is what they would have looked like in situ. In ancient times, they would have been on the edge of the water. They would have looked like they were moving and they were traveling. We also see what's called the sacred marriage, or the cosmic marriage of humans procreating. There are not a lot of these, but they are in each area, in the Tanumshede area, in western Sweden and eastern Norway, scattered around. Females have been identified by the ponytail, who knows, but they do look female, and often have what I'll show you in a moment that identifies them as women. So in contrast to many parts of the world, in the ancient world, there are not very many women depicted in the rock art. And of course, this is of interest to me. So I started looking at the rock art in its abstract form and found that there were other scholars that were asking the same question. Bible is female. So this is really, really unusual. Most ancient art has women where there's ample breasts, there's a pubic area that's shown, often they're shown pregnant, and they're associated with fertility. And these are from 25,000 BCE forward. And we don't have that here. So I found this kind of interesting. But we do have what's called fossum woman, and this is a panel in the fossum area. And this has become the mascot of the Biblica Museum that was built with Euro money about 10 years ago. It's a very nice museum, and in the Tanumshede area, and they have this on jewelry and t-shirts and all sorts of things. She does happen to be one of my favorites. And here we see a cut mark, which would be the womb area. I tend to think, not all of them, but I think that some of the cut marks may have been abstracted as representing female regenerative power. That they didn't need the whole figure, that maybe the cut mark was enough, depending on the context, The cut mark is the most common of the carvings. They're everywhere. You wonder if that's how they practiced. Here we see an Adorante figure that almost looks like they're juggling. Here's a sun symbol with a cross mark that's filled with dots. Dots here, dots here. They're ubiquitous. They're almost on any panel except in the north. Here's another one, very similar. This is a different panel. And look how interesting. Here's a crack, and it's filled. This follows the cracks. It's hard to know what was really going on. Here they filled in between these two cracks. But they are everywhere. Sometimes I think they were very utilitarian. As we see here in an Adorante figure, with 4 fingers, that's a month. The lunar cycle would have been really, really important for developing agriculture. And in ancient times, women cycled with the moon because there was no artificial light. So it also tied into menstrual cycles. So are some of these cut marks calendars? Are some of the cut marks that are used around the ships denoting the days of the journey that was taken or that's going to be taken? We don't know, but my mind really goes wild, as you can see. Again, the sun is female in Scandinavia, as it is in a number of countries. Are the sun symbols actually a symbol for the female? We don't know. We do know that Freya is associated with the sun, has a golden necklace. There's also rituals that survived into, again, the early 19th century, where in spring, a goddess, supposedly, was loaded onto a wagon and carried through the villages and around the fields. So can the wagons be denoting a deity or a female regenerativity? Here's the wagon. Here's the aurochs with the dot between their horns with alderante figures around it. So is this a myth about a sacred deity? We don't know. But I think it's very interesting. And they found a lot of wagons. Of course, in the agricultural times, they would have wagons. But it's interesting that the art denotes this with the alderante figures around it. We also see wagons with shaman, drawn by horses. I don't have an image for you tonight of the sun horse, but this is kind of what they look like, and then there's a sun right here. In this instance, it's almost as if the sun has come back and it's the wheel. So all of these rock art images point to a belief in an animistic and probably polytheistic spiritual world. And it was a developing spiritual system in which humans played obviously a very important role. And what kind of spiritual lives these people might have had, and under what circumstances the rock may have been created, we really won't know. But I think that there is evidence that there was a spiritual life really developing. I was really happy to see, I'm actually taking a rock art class, a rock art Northern Europe class from Linnaeus University online. I have to get up at 3:30 to take it in the morning because it's at 1 o'clock there. But I'm studying with Joachim Goldhahn at Linnaeus University in Kalmar. And I was very happy to see that there's 2 books that are probably 4 or 5 years old that were in Norwegian and Swedish, which have just been translated to English. And one of them I just got, and the other one's coming out in November. And I was really pleased to see that in my kind of crazy and wild speculations over the last 7 years, kind of doing this in isolation, that scholars are starting to also come to the same kinds of conclusions because there's been more archaeological work done. And in the past, archaeologists weren't very interested in rock art. And they have become more so. And we're finding with the archaeological digs that there is evidence of ritual around the rock art. There's evidence of temporary housing around the rock art. There's rock art underneath the huge cairns, big graves. So it's taking on a new importance in ways that it had not in the past, which is very exciting to me. So it might be argued that some of the northern art was sympathetic magic, trying to bring the deer or the elk to the people for their lives, for food, clothing, and shelter, that the plowing scenes were asking for fertility and abundance. But I think it goes beyond this. bit too simplistic. We know that this was not a stagnant, the rock art was not stagnant. It wasn't the same thing over and over and over. Although much of it is the same, so it probably was. There's also new things happening. As we can see here, here's Gerhard. As we can see here, this large figure, the little man, over the other rock art. This panel perhaps represents about 1,000 years. And I'm going to show you a little clip, see how he comes in and what he comes over and what's above him. What's interesting in this is that we don't know if this notated changes or if these were visions of what was going to come in the future. There's no way to know this. What's over this 8-foot man are these images which show Celtic shields and weapons, which is a much later age. Were these notated, something that's already happened, or were these visions of what was going to come? What is interesting, however, is on panels such as this, when there's rock art superimposed over older rock art, nothing was ever defaced. And in most of the ancient world, when a new spirituality came in, the statues and the images were hacked up, noses. That's why all the Greek, so much of the Greek imagery, the noses are hacked off and that sort of thing. So it's interesting that no scene was ruined. They were superimposed, but nothing was harmed in any way other than having something imposed over it. So I really do think that the rock art was used in a spiritual context. And again, spirituality, making meaning of our lives and what's important in our lives, separating it from the mundane. So we see that the subject matter of the carvings reflect elements of survival. They are often near water or in relation to the sun, both life-giving elements. They were created on a certain kind of rock that would make a certain sound. And actually, granite, if struck with the right implements, actually sparks as well, which would have kind of added to the magical quality. And carved in the same places over extended periods of time, perhaps over thousands of years. So, were they just hanging out and doodling in the same place? I don't think so. We see possible ritual activity, the shaman figures and the phallic figures, the dancing and aerobatic figures. It is possible to carve a cut mark in a half hour to an hour, and the other carvings probably would have taken, the larger ones, taken a couple of days. But for those of you who've traveled around the world, only Americans have to have an event in 45 minutes because they have to get back to work. Most people, when they are celebrating something special, many places around the world, these celebrations take several days. So this is all very possible. And the carvings, some of them were painted with ochre, and that could also put it in a ritual context. And then we have the archaeological and scientific evidence that there were large fires around the rock art that showed feasting and temporary activities, temporary dwellings. We found lures and the ceremonial axes, weapons, pointing to the authenticity of the images. And what's really interesting to me and what I want to return to do, I was a music major as an undergrad. I want to go back and do some acoustic studies. There's a lot of new work being done on the sound that the rock art would have made and the ambient sound around it. They were often created in special places where the sound is different, often with roaring rocks, but they're called roaring rocks along the creeks, waterfalls, water, and that sort of thing. So, to conclude here this evening, I'd like to show you a couple of clips of my ever-emerging documentary on rock art, showing you a little bit of what the effects might have been when people were actually there. I had to bring Fossil Woman back, my favorite. You'll see her one more time. For those of my students in the room, I'm also trying to link ancient myths with the archaeology called archaeomythology. Could this have been a solstice ritual? And finally, if you can try to imagine fires, feasting, probably singing and chanting, perhaps as part of the ritual, the rock actually being pecked, so that would have been a percussion sound. This could have really been quite an extravaganza, and I will leave you with this. Wait, it's better.
I know that some of the images were very white, but this is something that's been done later on just to show what it is. Some of the images were white, so white was
Yes, the white color is part of the documentation work.
okay.
We have this little liquid chalk mixture that we make, that we actually paint the rock art. It's sort of a braille system. And what you can see and then feel, and those are painted in. So there's definitely room, there's obviously a chance for error, because as we're painting them, we're interpreting them in a way too. Oh, does this really go all the way over there? And sometimes it's very, very hard, but the white was paint, chalk, and it doesn't hurt. So what happens is we do our own little ritual against no rain, because we're doing this. We have 1 week in the year where people are gathered from around the world that are doing this, and as soon as it rains, all that chalk runs off and it's all gone. So that chalk, it's meant to be painted on so it does not hurt the rock, and it goes away immediately. Yes?
With the Christianization of Scandinavia, have you found any defacing of the phallic symbols as well as the female breast? And maybe that could be a reason lack of.
No, there hasn't really
so
been any
the church has
defacing at all.
respected, as far as you're aware of, this ancient art compared to the rest of Europe.
Yes, and what's interesting
Especially during
is,
the Reformation.
much of this was hidden. Not
Which is a good thing.
intentionally,
I
but
know.
just dirt and things.
Good
So
for
they're
you.
still finding these.
Good for you.
Joachim Gohan is working now in eastern Sweden, and a year ago they'd only identified 30 sites, and now they're up to 120. So you have to look for them, because there's a layer of decomposed material in many of them. Yeah, but there is a little bit of defacing. What happened in the Viklika Museum, they did a exhibit on graffiti, and then we found swastikas.
Yes, that's understandable.
Yeah, so we don't like to talk about it as
I know,
graffiti, because
I know.
then somebody has to go and do it.
I know.
But actually, it's been pretty good. Just a minute, Kyle. Yes?
How do you know where to look for these? I mean, Sweden is full of granite, like, how do you go about finding them?
There's a couple of ways that this project works. There's mention of rock art and some documentation as early as the 1600s. And so sometimes we look at documents that can be anywhere from 200 to 400 years old. And other times it's oral tradition, because the farmers know where they are. They're out in the fields. And in the north, people that actually hunt and live up there. So often it's oral traditions. And then there's also some time in May where we have a rediscovering week, where we try to track down some of these sites and find them. But they're often in areas of transition. That's what's so interesting. So from arable land to the forest. Of course, that would have moved over 2,000 years. But in these areas where there's transitions, also where there would have been water. And then also now where there still is some areas where there still is water, like the creeks and the rivers. So they happen to be not always in places you think you're going to find them, but you can kind of guess. So, hi.
How much of this rock art's been found in Denmark?
Lots,
Okay.
but not as much. This area is a UNESCO heritage site. And the reason it is because they're so numerous. So an Alta area in Norway, in Tanumshede, in Sweden.
So it's been found all over, but the thing
I
is
don't know how to pronounce it.
Bornholm.
There's some rock art there. Yeah, just like you next, you first.
Do you find any connection between rock art around the world? I've seen petroglyphs along the Columbia River Gorge before they built the dam, and I was wondering how it also fit in with the myths. There's lots of Scandinavian myths about gods and goddesses. Do these fit somehow?
There's two questions here, I think.
Yeah.
There is a lot of overlap in world rock art, but there's also a lot of unique images in rock art around the world. The places where there's overlap is about survival, so often in relation to animals, the elements, fertility, human fertility, and nature fertility. But they're also really unique creatures, and many of them are fantastical. I was up in British Columbia in May, tromping around with some archaeologists, and I couldn't make heads or tails of any of that. The Snidel band, I met with an elder and we talked about it, but I'm not familiar with their myths. But if you know their myths, then you can start to make sense of the rock carvings. So, yes, they're the same around the world. In Europe, there's a lot of similarities, say, between the Italian Alps in it's called Valmonica, and Tanumshede. So, yes, similarity, but absolutely also really unique to each culture and region as well. Just like there's differences between the north and the south of Sweden.
I noticed no faces. Like a lot of the stuff, like she was mentioning, like she who watches, you know, is that distinctive face. But I didn't see any facial features.
No, not in this
Is that a
area.
later period? Would that be a later period than this?
I have not seen any faces on any of the Scandinavian
The boats. I'm
boats.
looking at the boats. Are there artifacts of actual boats in that area you can compare them to?
Yes and no.
I'm asking because of that second bowsprit, and there's certain things like they don't have sails. I didn't see oars.
I know they don't have any sails. They certainly don't look like Viking ships.
I was wondering, could they have been catamarans? They're sort of like a side view, the second bow.
I don't know, and I haven't looked into the boats as much as I'd like to. I think that's a very good question. But they definitely have found, various boats, especially in bogs. But that's a little bit later. That's Bronze Age. Yeah. But you notice there were what they call crew marks. There were I don't want to say they were manned. They were human to move the boats. So they may have just had oars. We don't know. They certainly had cloth in the Bronze Age, so there could have been sails, and I'm missing people.
How do they figure out the dates of when they were done?
That's really tricky. For those of you who know about archaeology, we have a carbon dating system that doesn't work with rocks. So a really big debate in the academic community is, and this is why I brought it up here, that sometimes people say in the rock art, oh, there's horses here, so it has to be at this point in time. And my indigenous friends are saying, no, those are notations of our seers. They had visions of the horses coming. That's what happens in the Pacific Northwest. So that's what we don't know. Were they actually something that the people saw and used, or were they visions, futuristic visions? So that's one of the big points. Same with the lure players. Were these visions, or were the lures actually around, and were they using them? We don't know. However, very interesting. One of the leading archaeologists in British Columbia, Canada, had a colleague there when I was there in May, and up there they were going to rocks. There's a lot of standing rocks there that have rock art, and they were pushing down to see how much decomposed stuff there was, and they were taking notes, and they're going to go back and dig up the soil around these rocks and see if they can find the flakes from how they were pecked, and then they could carve and date the fur needles and all the gunk, and that would give them some sort of date.
On his point with the boats, how do
Yeah.
you tell the difference between the boats and the sleds? because they look almost exactly alike, and the boats are always, seem to be filled in.
The boats usually have both ends. What's interesting in eastern Sweden is sometimes you'll just see the two ends and the middle's disappeared, and they think that it was showing a journey to the underworld and the boat was disappearing into the rock. So the two ends seem to be the indicator. But you can't, what? No, what do you think?
Everything here, one, boom, very good, 1 and 2. This is boom,
Or is it
yeah, this one, yeah, wow,
Long one.
1 and 2.
Let's have radioes.
Yes, 1, here, boom. There, 2.
But sometimes it's hard to tell the difference. You know more than I do.
So, if there's some theory that maybe some of the rock art is from the maybe the futuristic, what could be happening, and because there's so many boats, and maybe some of the boats have different origins, could this, and because the archaeological evidence is coming along, could this have been a gathering of people for celebration and ritual from that whole
From
area?
different
where,
places?
Yes. Where
I
they're
don't see
coming
why
in,
not.
And then,
Yeah.
and because there's so much of it, at that one spot, could this have been every year we gathered for the celebration and they added on and added on?
Could be. Could be. Wish they would have left some writing.
I know.
We will take another question, and then you can also
Would I
ask,
just
we are
ask-
going to have questions afterwards, you can ask in the
Okay.
finished room also afterwards, so.
But I thank you for sharing this research. I just wondered if you had any contact with the people in Finland who are studying this, because there are this rock art in Finland as well. But have you
Right.
heard of that, or?
Yes, and I'll be able to tell you more in about 4 weeks because that's one of the things we're looking at in this class.
Oh.
But I have not, no. I mean, I'm very aware of it. The entire area, and into Russia as well, has rock art. So it's really everywhere, particularly in the north. But I haven't looked at it yet. And there's actually more rock painting in Finland as well, which
Yeah.
we don't see,
Yeah.
which we don't see in Sweden.
But they don't have an institute like you have preserving it, as far as I know, anyway.
So you just have to find some crazy people to start.
Good, thank you.
Okay, so you can ask afterwards.
Okay, now as long as anybody wants to talk with me.
I want to thank you very much. It was a really absolute superb presentation. Thank you.
I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Your whole program, the whole thing, and your love for the thing really came through, and you made us love it.